Since early 2026, the confrontation between the United States, Israel, and Iran has entered a dangerous phase that increasingly resembles a structural regional war rather than another temporary cycle of escalation. What initially appeared as a continuation of earlier limited strikes quickly transformed into a broader strategic contest involving energy corridors, missile deterrence networks, proxy forces, and competing visions of regional order across the Middle East. For Washington and Jerusalem, the campaign was never only about battlefield success, but about reshaping Iran's long-term capacity to threaten allies, influence neighboring states, and pursue nuclear breakout options under strategic ambiguity. However, defining victory in such a conflict is inherently complicated because conventional military superiority does not automatically translate into political outcomes capable of transforming adversary regimes or permanently neutralizing asymmetric threats. The early strike phase demonstrated overwhelming coalition airpower, with hundreds of precision attacks targeting command infrastructure, missile launch systems, air defense nodes, and leadership compounds across multiple Iranian provinces simultaneously. These operations aimed to decapitate centralized command structures quickly enough to disrupt coordination between the Revolutionary Guard, regular armed forces, and regional proxy networks operating across Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Although several senior figures were eliminated during the opening bombardments, Iranian retaliation demonstrated that decision-making authority had already shifted toward decentralized regional commanders capable of continuing coordinated operations independently. This decentralization reduced the strategic shock expected from leadership losses and allowed Tehran to respond rapidly, with missile launches targeting Israeli territory, American installations, and infrastructure belonging to Gulf partner states. Such retaliation followed a deliberate escalation logic designed not to defeat the coalition militarily, but instead to raise regional costs high enough to pressure external actors into demanding limits on further Western operations. Iran's strategy therefore relied less on territorial defense and more on widening the conflict's geography, forcing energy markets, shipping routes, and neighboring governments to share the consequences of continued escalation. One of the most consequential steps in this approach was the disruption of maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point responsible for roughly one-fifth of global seaborne oil exports. By targeting tankers, deploying naval mines, and activating coastal missile batteries, Tehran demonstrated that even weakened conventional forces could still threaten global trade flows central to Western economic stability. The resulting surge in energy prices illustrated how asymmetric leverage at strategic choke points can compensate partially for technological inferiority in direct air and naval confrontation with advanced coalition forces. Washington attempted to counter these disruptions through convoy protection operations, airstrikes against coastal launch systems, and planning for mine-clearing missions intended to reopen limited shipping corridors under military escort. Yet such operations require time, coordination, and multinational participation, and several allied governments signaled reluctance to become directly involved in a conflict perceived primarily as American strategic responsibility. This hesitation highlighted a persistent challenge for United States leadership, namely sustaining coalition cohesion when military objectives extend beyond immediate collective defense commitments into regime-level strategic confrontation. Meanwhile, Israel continued focusing its operations on degrading missile launch capacity, recognizing that Iran's ballistic arsenal remained its most credible tool for maintaining deterrence after losing air defense effectiveness earlier in the campaign. Reports indicated that hundreds of launch platforms were destroyed or disabled, significantly reducing salvo frequency compared with the war's opening days, though remaining systems continued to pose intermittent operational risks. At the same time, Iran relied increasingly on inexpensive drone swarms capable of overwhelming sophisticated air defense interceptors through volume rather than technological sophistication, creating persistent pressure on regional defense budgets. Such drone warfare reflects a broader shift in modern conflict, where affordability and mass production sometimes offset precision advantages traditionally associated with advanced Western military platforms. Interestingly, regional partners began exploring cooperation with Ukraine, whose experience countering large-scale drone attacks offered practical solutions for defending infrastructure against persistent low-cost aerial harassment campaigns. This emerging cooperation demonstrated how lessons from European battlefields increasingly influence Middle Eastern security planning, reinforcing the interconnected nature of contemporary conflicts across geographically distant theaters. Despite sustained coalition air superiority, Iran continued striking selected targets across Gulf states, signaling that its deterrence posture remained functional even after losing significant portions of its conventional command architecture. These calibrated strikes were not random demonstrations of capability, but carefully chosen signals designed to discourage attacks on Iranian energy infrastructure by threatening equivalent damage across neighboring export facilities. However, escalation thresholds shifted dramatically once both sides began targeting gas production sites previously considered too destabilizing to strike during earlier phases of confrontation. The exchange involving Emirati and Qatari facilities revealed how quickly mutual restraint can erode once battlefield momentum encourages risk-taking aimed at altering negotiating leverage rather than achieving decisive victory. Such developments increase the probability of broader regional economic disruption, especially if desalination infrastructure or export terminals became sustained targets during extended phases of strategic retaliation. From a purely conventional military perspective, the United States and Israel maintained overwhelming operational superiority throughout the conflict's early months, striking targets across Iranian territory with relative freedom of maneuver. Nevertheless, asymmetric warfare conditions prevented this superiority from translating into decisive political transformation inside Iran's governing system or eliminating its long-term deterrence capabilities entirely. Regime change remained the most ambitious objective associated with coalition strategy because removing the clerical leadership structure would theoretically resolve nuclear, missile, and proxy-related challenges simultaneously. Yet leadership decapitation alone rarely produces systemic collapse unless accompanied by mass domestic uprisings capable of replacing existing institutions with alternative political authority structures recognized nationally. Although Iran experienced major protest movements earlier in the decade, wartime conditions historically strengthened centralized control mechanisms rather than weakening them, especially when external threats reinforce nationalist narratives within society. Security organizations such as the Revolutionary Guard therefore retained sufficient cohesion to maintain internal order despite leadership losses and infrastructure damage resulting from sustained aerial bombardment campaigns. Furthermore, Iran's geography complicates any scenario involving foreign ground intervention because mountainous terrain, vast deserts, and limited access corridors restrict maneuver options for large expeditionary forces. Even amphibious operations along the southern coastline would require extensive logistical preparation, while remaining vulnerable to missile and drone attacks launched from inland positions difficult to neutralize permanently. Limited territorial objectives, such as securing strategic islands near Hormuz, might be achievable militarily, yet they would not necessarily produce the political collapse required to transform Iran's governing system fundamentally. Consequently, coalition planners appear to favor pressure strategies aimed at long-term degradation rather than rapid occupation scenarios involving extended deployment of ground forces inside Iranian territory. Another frequently discussed possibility involved encouraging insurgencies among ethnic minority regions including Kurdish, Arab, and Balochi populations historically resistant to centralized authority from Tehran. However, these movements lacked unified command structures capable of coordinating nationwide offensives, and neighboring states demonstrated little willingness to provide sanctuary for cross-border operations supporting insurgent escalation. Without external territorial support or widespread defections inside security institutions, such insurgencies remained insufficient to threaten the regime's survival in the absence of simultaneous military collapse elsewhere. Meanwhile, the question of Iran's nuclear program remains central to coalition strategic messaging, even though operational targeting priorities shifted toward missile infrastructure during later phases of the campaign. Earlier strikes had already damaged enrichment facilities significantly, yet analysts estimated that sufficient enriched material remained available for multiple potential weapons if reconstruction efforts proceeded without external interruption. Because underground facilities are difficult to verify through aerial surveillance alone, eliminating nuclear breakout capacity entirely would likely require inspection, access, or ground presence. Neither side appeared prepared to accept politically, thus the coalition achieved partial disruption rather than irreversible dismantlement, leaving unresolved uncertainty about Iran's long-term nuclear trajectory despite repeated assurances of successful infrastructure degradation. Conventional military losses nevertheless constrained Iran's ability to project influence through regional proxies at previous levels, particularly where logistics depended on centralized missile production and transportation networks now under sustained pressure. Even so, the persistence of limited strike capability ensured that Gulf states continued facing security risks, requiring costly defensive measures against unpredictable drone and missile activity throughout the conflict's duration. This situation complicated coalition claims of decisive victory because protecting allies represents a central expectation attached to American strategic leadership across energy-producing regions of the Middle East. Equally important was the continuing closure of maritime corridors through Hormuz, which symbolized the limits of military dominance when confronting geographically embedded asymmetric denial strategies. Failure to reopen that passage quickly undermined perceptions of Western capacity to guarantee uninterrupted global trade flows, a cornerstone assumption supporting decades of international economic stability. Such perceptions influence not only regional actors but also emerging powers, evaluating whether American security guarantees remain reliable under conditions of prolonged multi-theater competition. From Tehran's perspective, maintaining disruption without direct battlefield parity represented a rational strategy, designed to offset losses by shifting confrontation into economic and diplomatic domains, where leverage remained available. This approach relied heavily on demonstrating resilience rather than achieving tactical victories, reinforcing the narrative that survival itself constitutes strategic success against technologically superior adversaries. Meanwhile, Washington faced increasing pressure to balance escalation risks with domestic political expectations demanding visible progress toward defined strategic objectives within acceptable timeframes. In conflicts lacking clear front lines or surrender scenarios, such expectations often clash with operational realities, requiring patience rather than dramatic demonstrations of decisive victory. Israeli leadership similarly confronted the challenge of sustaining deterrence credibility while avoiding actions that might trigger uncontrollable regional escalation involving additional non-state actors or neighboring governments. Therefore, both coalition partners operated within a narrow strategic corridor between demonstrating resolve and avoiding commitments that could transform limited campaigns into prolonged regional wars. As the conflict progressed, analysts increasingly concluded that degrading Iran's capabilities did not automatically eliminate its influence, because ideology, institutional networks, and proxy relationships survived infrastructure losses. These surviving elements ensured that Tehran retained options for continuing indirect confrontation even if conventional military balance shifted significantly in favor of its adversaries. Consequently, assessing victory required evaluating whether coalition operations changed Iran's long-term strategic behavior, rather than measuring destroyed equipment or eliminated leadership figures alone. Evidence suggested that while Iran's operational capacity declined substantially, its willingness to challenge regional order remained largely unchanged under continuing external pressure conditions. This distinction illustrates why modern strategic conflicts often produce ambiguous outcomes despite overwhelming disparities in technological capability between opposing coalitions. Ultimately, the coalition succeeded in imposing severe damage across multiple sectors of Iran's military-industrial complex, delaying reconstruction timelines, potentially extending across several decades under continued sanctions pressure. However, regime continuity, persistent missile capability, and ongoing maritime disruption prevented these achievements from translating into uncontested geopolitical dominance across the wider Middle Eastern theater. Therefore, although Washington retained the option to declare success domestically, international observers remained divided regarding whether stated strategic objectives had been fully achieved in practical operational terms. Until maritime routes reopen securely, regional allies feel consistently protected, and nuclear ambiguity disappears permanently, claims of decisive victory will likely remain contested across diplomatic and analytical communities worldwide. For now, the conflict demonstrates that in contemporary geopolitical competition, survival, resilience, and disruption often matter as much as battlefield superiority in determining long-term strategic outcomes between asymmetric adversaries.